function enough to play, so that's a good thing.
That's a miracle.
Are we good to go?
No.
No.
Yes. Maybe.
Wait, this just in. There we go. There it is. We just got the notification. So, we want to welcome everybody who's watching at home, whether you're watching live or throughout the week. I think we hit 500 views this week. We hit 1,300 last week. Keep sharing that video. Keep coming back. Don't forget you can go to our church website and you can hit prayer requests. Send one directly to me. You can even do your giving online through our website. But we are grateful that you come and visit us electronically. So, been thinking about my dad this week. My dad didn't cook much when I was growing up. In fact, my dad had basically three things that he made. And what a unique combination of things they were. He made homemade cornmeal mush, which we loved when he made it. He made hand-rolled tamales. I never understood where that one came from, but it was good. And then he made this hickory smoked grilled beef roast. Those were his three dishes that he would make. He didn't make them very often, and they were a huge deal when he made them. Well, that meant that my mom did the bulk of the cooking, and that was until we got a little older, because both my parents worked, so my mom decided when we got a little older that we were going to take turns cooking. So by the time I was about 8, I got one turn a week. I think I've shared that before. I always made pancakes because it was the only thing I knew how to make. But other than that, my mom did most of the cooking. And that meant that my mom cooking dinner was A, a day ending in Y, and B, always delicious, simple, everyday fare. Just good cooking, home cooking. When my dad would do it, it was an all-day event. Regardless of which of his three signature dishes he made, they took forever to make. And when I say forever, I'm barely exaggerating. Mom would sweep in after a long day at work. She would whip up something easy peasy, 1, 2, 3. It would be delicious. We would all be happy. Dad would set aside an entire Saturday, and he would monopolize every square inch of the kitchen when he decided he was going to cook. Now, don't get me wrong. Like I said, they were all really good, but all really time-consuming. The roast, for instance, it went like this. He would start the roast the night before. He would marinate it overnight in his special marinade. I honestly couldn't tell you what that was, but he had a special marinade that he would marinate that roast in overnight in the fridge. And then on Saturday afternoon, he had this, those charcoal starters that you pack with newspaper and charcoal. Well, he got tired of those wearing out, so he had one machine manufactured by a guy in our area. So he would get out his machine manufactured charcoal starter, pack it with paper, pack it with charcoal, get the charcoal going. When it was ready, we had this tiny little grill. You gotta remember, we're talking the 60s. Tiny little grill that was built in on a pole in our patio. It didn't even hardly look like a grill. It almost looked like a hibachi on a pole, This tiny little grill, but he would dump the coals in, and then he had machine fabricated shields, almost like heavy cookie sheets that he had made by the same guy who made the charcoal starter. And they were made to slide in the sides of this grill to deflect the wind the right way. My dad was an engineer. So he would carefully put these things in, and he would start cooking this roast. And he would grill, and he would grill, and he would grill. And did I mention he would grill? This roast took a long time to cook. Even though, as you see in the picture, that's not a picture of his roast, but pretty close. He liked them, walk the meat past the stove, kind of thing. He liked a rare roast, but they still took a long time. Well, then, quite a ways into the process, he had chunks of hickory wood. We would go out in the woods, we'd find a small hickory tree, cut it down, cut it into hunks. He had a special container in the garage that he soaked the hickory wood in all the time, all summer. And then at a certain point in this process, he would take some of that wood out, put it on the coals, and of course it would smoke like mad because it would be wet and had been soaking. And that hickory smoke would come up through that meat, and he would smoke that meat. And the smell of that hickory smoke and that meat cooking was amazing, truly amazing. So the end result was delicious, not gonna lie, one of the best roasts I've ever had, but not usually ready until about 8:30 or 9 at night. It'd be dinner, but we couldn't eat dinner till 8:30 or 9 at night, so we all knew not to plan, anything on the night that Dad was gonna cook the roast. I would call her and say, I probably can't come over and see you because Dad's making roast tonight. So today we begin a brand new sermon series, and it's called The Five Sacrifices. The Five Sacrifices, and it's based, oddly enough, on this list that's found in the Old Testament book of Leviticus. And if you've ever tried to read the Bible through in a year, for example, Leviticus is the one that once you get through it, you need a t-shirt that said, I survived Leviticus. Leviticus is a hard book to get through, but this is in there and it's really good stuff. I called it the Five Sacrifices, and that's one of the ways it's referred to. You might also read it called the Five Offerings. And what it does is it provides powerful views on connecting with God. And it's also seen as a bridge to God's gift of his Son, as found in the Gospels of the New Testament. So you got these offerings of the law in the book of Leviticus, and they serve a threefold approach. One, they provide a way to help keep us in right relationship with God. Two, us Christians see them as a metaphor for Jesus' sacrifice for us. And three, they're a pattern for how we are to approach God. So today we start with the very first sacrifice, the very first offering. And the Old Testament book of Leviticus calls this one the burnt offering. Doesn't sound very appealing, but walk through it with me. Because it's seen as the first step toward loving God more perfectly. That's what the burnt offering is. And it's found in the very first chapter of the book of Leviticus. Hear these words.
The Lord spoke to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. And he said, speak to the Israelites and say to them, when anyone among you brings an offering to the Lord, bring as your offering an animal from either the herd or the flock. You are to offer a male without defect. You must present it at the entrance to the tent of meeting, so that it will be acceptable to the Lord. You are to lay your hands on the head of the burnt offering. and it will be accepted on your behalf to make atonement for you. It is a burnt offering, a food offering, an aroma pleasing to the Lord.
Okay, so you've got this sacrificial system of offerings. It's ordained by God, laid out in the book of Leviticus, and it really comes from the heart, the very heart of Jewish life. It's really kind of the core of the Jewish understanding of connection to God as found in the Old Testament. So through the never-ending glow of the fire at the altar of sacrifice, the way they saw it was, God was burning into the hearts of the people an awareness of their sin. Kind of where this comes out of. And again, we see it as a foreshadowing of the coming sacrifice of Jesus. But the whole thing, the whole package starts with this burnt offering, this burnt sacrifice. Notice it was to be completely consumed by the fire. None of it was to be eaten. Unlike my dad's roast, you weren't cooking it with the intent on eating it. You were putting it on the fire with the intent of it being a complete sacrifice to God. Very important also that the altar fire never went out. That's an important piece here, was to be kind of the eternal flame. So the way it worked is the common Israelite worshiper would bring a male animal to the door of the tabernacle. They would choose one, they would bring it with them, and the animal was to be, the word was perfect, without defect, the best you had, in other words. The innocent animal was designed to stand in for the sinner, and the burnt offering was done to make up not for anything the animal did, because it was perfect, but instead stand in for the sins of the worshiper who brought this offering. And again, the entire animal was to be consumed by the fire, and this pleasant aroma rising up to God. How appropriate that we have this breakfast going on this morning as this pleasant aroma washes up through the building. But as I said, from our perspective as Christians, it also serves as this metaphor for Jesus. Because he gave himself as a sacrifice to God on our behalf. So we need to hang on to that even though it was an Old Testament piece, for us, we see more metaphor in it than that. This burnt offering is the first of 3 that we're going to look at. There are 5 total, but the first 3 are called voluntary offerings, voluntary sacrifices. They're also known as ascending sacrifices or ascending offerings, because they all 3 were offered by fire, and they all 3 have this ascending fragrance that they lift up to God through their actions. They also all 3 mark this progression about closeness to God. The first offering, the one we look at today, is mentioned as bringing us the closest to God, the most pleasing to God, and the last of the 3 voluntary ones, which we'll look at in a couple weeks, is seen as the first step in approaching God. You go, wait a minute, that seems backward. We start with the one that brings us closest, and we work toward the one that is the first step. Yeah, for us that's backward, but that's not unusual for the Bible, especially the Old Testament approach, because God usually begins from his perspective and not ours. usually we begin with what is called the upper story, and it works toward us. So we are seeing this from God's perspective. So this first sacrifice, this burnt sacrifice, this burnt offering, it sits right here at the beginning because of what it represents. And it represents complete surrender to the process. A complete surrender to God. So complete surrender. Let's be honest, that's a challenging place to be. Because we are not taught to surrender to really much of anything in this country. Surrender is not a word that we are usually comfortable with. We rebel against injustice. We will rebel against the political system all the time. We rebel against basically everything. And in many cases, there's a good reason. It's who we are as people. It's how this country is founded. But why is that? Why is it that we are almost trained to rebel against everything? Well, it's because we rebel against human systems. We rebel against the inadequacy and the incompleteness of human systems and institutions. Because they are contrasted and supported by us marvelously flawed people. So history has taught us that it's a slippery slope if we try to completely surrender to the human institution, right? We've seen what happens when people do that. Nazi Germany is a great example of surrendering to a human institution. So we are taught not to do that. But that inherent distrust that we have in us, warranted though it is, against human institution, often causes us to also not be willing to trust God. Think about that. We are taught not to trust human institution, but because of that, it often means it's hard for us to really put our trust in God. We have a hard time parsing out God's influence on our lives versus the constant barrage of everyday life. And so we get reluctant, often unwilling, to completely surrender to God. Because when you completely surrender to God, what happens? You lose control, right? And if anything, we all want control. But as I've said countless times, the truth is, control is simply an illusion. We have absolutely no control over life, period. Let me say that again. We have no control whatsoever over life, period, end of sentence. And if you don't believe me, talk to anybody who thought they had everything under control and then they received an unexpected health diagnosis, or they had the sudden loss of a loved one, or something like that. We have no control over life. What we do have control over is how we react to life. And today's scripture, today's sacrifice, tells me how we need to react to the uncertainty of life is through surrender to God. Complete surrender. That's how we need to react to life, is through complete surrender to God. Because the burnt sacrifice, the burnt offering, if you will, as found in the book of Leviticus, is all about that. It's all about complete surrender. We offer the best that we have, the livestock without blemish, if you will. We offer it to God to be completely consumed by the sacrifice and to raise that pleasing aroma up to God. And so there are two key pieces that I want you to walk away from today with. I want you to carry two key things away from today. The first would be offer the best you have to God. Because I think we tend to give God our leftovers. And notice I said we. I'm not casting stones. That's what us humans do. We offer God the time we don't spend on everything else. We offer God the attention that we don't pay to everything else. We offer God the resources that we don't spend on everything else. So God often gets whatever we happen to have left over at the end of the week or the month or the year. That's what we tend to give God. But this first sacrifice reminds me that instead, we should be giving him the best that we have, period. The best we have to offer, we should give him, to use that marvelously biblical term, our first fruits. We should be offering him the livestock without blemish, the perfect livestock. Okay, so I said there were two things. One is that. The other thing I want you to carry away from today is the pleasing aroma. And again, I did not plan for today to fall on the day of the all-church breakfast, but it is fortuitous to walk in the building today and smell that smell. I could smell that smell when I took the dog out at 5:15 this morning, because anything that gets cooked in that kitchen fills that whole area between the parsonage and the church with whatever it is. But you walk in the building on a day like today or on a Wednesday night, and the whole building is filled with that pleasing aroma. There's nothing like it. You walk into the house when you get home, or you walk into a restaurant, or you walk into your church when cooking is going on, and you can't miss it. And it takes you to a place you have not been. Because the pleasing aroma of food is more than just a nice experience. It literally transports us to a different time and place. It changes our mood. It creates a totally new and uplifting environment. And that's what we want to be for God. We want to be this pleasing aroma to God that brings him great joy and that reflects the joy that he offers us. So give God your best. Offer God the livestock without blemish. Be the pleasing aroma that he wants you to be. Be the burnt offering in the absolute best sense of that term and its understanding. And then be fully consumed and be willing to totally surrender to God. Would you pray with me? Father God, thank you. Thank you for these sacrifices. Sacrifice is a hard word, Lord. And a burnt sacrifice sounds terrible until you unpack it, until you think it through, until you hear that it's all about complete surrender. and completely giving in to you, and about a pleasing aroma. Those are great images, God, and that's what we want to be. We want to be the people who offer all of those things to you. So, Lord, be with us now as we come to you during a time of offering. Fill us with your Spirit. Fill us with your Spirit, Lord, and use these gifts in powerful ways. For it is in your name that we pray. Amen.